it's one of the reasons why we have Why We Forget as the lead part of the title of our book, because forgetting is actually an extremely important feature of the way that human memory works. If you think about how inefficient it would be if every time that we were trying to learn from our past experiences, we had to sift through all of the details of everything that we'd previously experienced, it would be a very slow process. We would often be bringing irrelevant information to mind, outdated information to mind. If you're trying to recognize your friend, you don't want to be cycling through what they look like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, right? You want that quick update of what they look like the last time you saw them in order to recognize them today. And so this tendency for us to forget a lot of the details, to forget where we parked 2 weeks ago, but hopefully remember where we parked this morning, all of those are actually really important characteristics of a healthy, well-functioning memory system.
Hello, and a warm welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're examining a subject that will eventually impact us all, forgetting and remembering, and what we can do about it. Well, a professional partnership between a neurologist and a neuroscientist have resulted in a new book which shines some fresh light on the science of memory and offers us some very useful tips on how to stay sharp as we age. It's a pleasure to introduce the authors of the book, who are our guests today. Dr. Elizabeth Kensinger is a professor and chair of Boston College's Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. She directs a research lab that investigates many aspects of human memory, including how emotion, stress, and sleep affect memory, and how memory shifts as we age. Dr. Andrew Budson is a professor of neurology at Boston University. He's a lecturer in neurology at Harvard Medical School and chief of cognitive and behavioral neurology at the Veterans Affairs Boston Healthcare System. Wow, big long title. His work combines education, research, and clinical care to help those with memory disorders. So Elizabeth and Andrew, welcome to you both. Well, I found this book to be illuminating and very comprehensive. You explain how memory works, the different types of memory, and then you list factors that affect it, from sleep to drugs, alcohol to exercise. And then you provide readers with some very valuable strategies and little cheats to assist us in remembering. So, Andrew, let's start with you. We're all living longer with much higher expectations of performance and life quality than our ancestors. How can we tell if we're just experiencing normal memory lapses from normal aging or significant cognitive decline? And are the growing number of people that we see with Alzheimer's and other disorders merely a symptom of this longevity, or are they linked to any sort of environmental factors that you know about?
Yeah, so these are wonderful questions. So what we describe in the book and the way that I think about it is there's three common changes that occur as part of normal aging. And that includes that information may need to be repeated once or twice in order for it to get into our memory stores. It may take a little bit of time for us to find and retrieve the information that we're looking for. And we may need a hint or a cue in order to retrieve that name or whatever piece of information we're searching for. And I want to contrast those parts of normal aging with some things that are not normal and would make one concerned that there could possibly be Alzheimer's disease or another problem with memory. And that includes if people are getting lost repeatedly, even on routes that are familiar to them, if they are losing things, not able to keep track of things in a way that is different and new from the way it was before, And lastly, if people are repeating the same questions again and again and again, or repeating the same stories over and over and over again to the same people, those are things that are not so normal, even when one gets older. And those are things that I would recommend that people might begin by simply, speaking to, friends and family about whether they have noticed any changes. And if the answer is yes, then going to one's doctor and getting the memory checked out. Now, in terms of your other good question about, are we as a society developing more Alzheimer's, just because people are getting older? And the main answer to that question is yes. As healthcare has done a better job at treating heart disease, at treating cancers, and people are living longer, more and more people are living into the prime age when Alzheimer's can begin to affect them, in their late 70s, 80s, and beyond. But having said that, we do know that there's a number of different environmental factors that make a difference. We might get into some of these more later in the program. Keeping healthy, including eating a healthy diet, staying physically active, using substances like alcohol in moderation. All of these things affect thinking and memory and our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And even pollution has been found to be something that can increase the risk of Alzheimer's.
So there's actually a bit of truth in both aspects. Yes, there are more because there are more people, but we're finding out more about the causes.
Exactly right.
Okay, so Elizabeth, we have this kind of misconception probably, that your brain is kind of like a storage facility that you just put stuff in it and then you pull it out. You go and get that file and you pull it out. And instead of it being a much more active kind of process. So can you explain to us what the most common misconceptions are about memory?
Absolutely. I think you just struck on the most apparent misconception, which is this idea that memory is a file storage system and our memories just sit waiting to be retrieved. And just like it doesn't take much effort to pull a file out of a folder, it shouldn't take much effort to pull a memory out of storage. And we really try to emphasize in the book that memory takes effort. And so, I think many of us have the misconception that if our memory is working well, we should just effortlessly be able to create memories and to retrieve them. And that just really isn't right. In order to have memories be created in ways that are going to be long lasting, we have to put in a lot of effort on that front end. As we're experiencing events, we have to be thinking about what's going on. We have to be, going over our notes, and we'll talk more about the best ways to do that later on. But, we have to really be exerting that type of effort. And similarly, at the time that we're trying to bring a memory back to mind, it's an effortful process. We have to rebuild that memory in some sense. And so we have to be devoting attention and effort at retrieval. I think a related misconception, and a very common one, is that forgetting is bad. And that forgetting is always bad. And that, if we could optimize our memories, what we would want is to have a memory system that remembers much more than what our memory system actually does. And it's one of the reasons why we have Why We Forget as the lead part of the title of our book, because forgetting is actually an extremely important feature of the way that human memory works. If you think about how inefficient it would be if every time that we were trying to learn from our past experiences, we had to sift through all of the details of everything that we'd previously experienced, it would be a very slow process. We would often be bringing irrelevant information to mind, outdated information to mind. If you're trying to recognize your friend, you don't want to be cycling through what they look like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, right? You want that quick update of what they look like the last time you saw them in order to recognize them today. And so this tendency for us to forget a lot of the details, to forget where we parked 2 weeks ago, but hopefully remember where we parked this morning, all of those are actually really important characteristics of a healthy, well-functioning memory system. So there's, the two sides to it. It's what we remember, but it also really is what we forget that together enables us to have a memory system that serves us well in daily life.
And there's sort of 3 phases. You've got to encode it, store it, and retrieve it. So it's quite an elaborate process, really.
It exactly is. And we talk about it in the book as a cycle. So when we experience an event, we have to do a lot of work in order to get that event from being something that is happening in the external world or that we're thinking about in this one moment of time into a format of cellular connections that our brain is able to create that can then actually go on to the next phase of storage, which means that it doesn't just exist for a few minutes, but it can actually exist for days, weeks, even years. And then at the moment that we want to think about that experience again, we actually have to go through an active process of rebuilding that memory. And so in the book, we talk about this process of, encoding being like initially assembling a structure out of blocks, storage being like writing the blueprints, which are written into a particular portion of the brain called the hippocampus. And then retrieval having to be this active process where we actually have to use those blueprints. We have to read them. We have to rebuild the structure. But now that we've rebuilt that structure, we're actually needing to re-encode it into memory. And we might be adjusting the blueprints in the process. So again, in that example where our friend has changed their hairstyle over the last, few months, we're going to be rewriting the blueprints to update the representation of that person so that we don't have outdated information that we're constantly storing in memory. So there's always this cyclical process. And at every stage, it's a really effortful and active process that's going on.
That's interesting because we tend to think of it as much more static, and it seems to be much more fluid memory.
That's exactly right. And I think when you think about this building process, it just helps to make sense why memories can be erroneous, why we can forget different elements, why each time that we think about an event, we might think about it in a slightly different way because we really are building that memory each time.
So, Andrew, let's pop back to you. Modern living is super challenging. We were just talking about this. We've got developments now that didn't exist 50 years ago. We've got this constant barrage of stuff on the cell phone. We've got people talking to us, texting us, we're doing directions. And you say we have to remember where you parked in the 14-level car structure, the garage. So are we perhaps expecting a little bit too much of our brains by overtaxing them constantly with sensory input so that this multitasking is actually making our brains addled?
Well, I don't know if it makes everyone's brain addled, but there's no doubt that there really does, at least to me, it seems like there's much more to remember than there was a few years ago. I mean, growing up, maybe we had to remember a few phone numbers of our friends, but we didn't have to remember passwords and, all this other type of information. And I do think that there often is a perception that, we can remember everything and we can multitask and, be like on our phone, like while we're studying, or thinking that, we can pay attention to our friend on the Zoom while we're checking our email. It's like, the answer is no, you really cannot do that. I mean, people really cannot successfully multitask. If you divide your attention, you're just simply not going to be able to remember things as well as if you pay attention. And that's the truth.
So I think we need to, simplify somewhat. So we're paying attention to individual things at given moments. But more than that, isn't there just an innate stress in trying to do that fries your brain? I mean, it's not a natural state to be in, to ask your brain to be doing all these things well at the same time, right?
Yeah, I think without a doubt, if you are trying to remember, 10 different things at once and do the multitasking and trying to do all of this, you're not going to be able to remember any one individual things as well as if you just really focused on that thing. And that is, the definite truth. So I totally agree. The other thing I think is that, people often have the expectation that they will be able to remember everything well. And they think something's like wrong, if they're not able to, retrieve all that information, whether it's, when they meeting up with their friend again, and then now they realize they can't remember what they discussed last time, or whether you're a student and you're showing up for the exam and realizing that you can't remember it as well. So the moral of the story is, if you focus and pay attention, then you're going to remember things better.
Well, that brings me to Elizabeth there, because in the book, there's a mnemonic device of 4 that you recommend, which are critical to having information encoded in your brain. So perhaps you could just go over the 4 with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really, as you just said, for that first step, how do you actually build that memory so that it is actually going to be something that the brain can store and that can be accessible later? And as we were reading the literature and thinking about, how to bring this all together, we use this mnemonic of 4 for the 4 things that it's most important that you do. And so that stands for focus, organize, understand the information, and relate it to something you know. And as Andrew just very nicely talked about, that focus part is really the most important one. Focus attention. If you're not focused on what it is that you want to remember, that information is going to very quickly be gone. You have to be focused on it. But just focusing your attention on it also often isn't enough to have it be built in a really robust way that's going to be stored successfully. And so that's when the organizing, the understanding, and the relating come in. So it turns out that you could imagine assembling a structure that has 100 different blocks. That's going to be a really difficult structure to get stored in memory with all of those different details. But now you can imagine maybe one of those blocks contains a little bit more information that's well organized. And so rather than the structure needing to be 100 individual blocks, maybe it can be 10 blocks, and each of those blocks can contain some different details. And that's essentially this idea of chunking. It's just what we've done with 4. We've taken, 4 individualized elements and put them together into one thing that can organize that information and make it a little bit easier to remember. Similarly, if you are trying to memorize a long password that has lots of letters and numbers in it, maybe you can come up with, some words that it makes, or some sentences where each is the first letter, right? Something that helps to actually organize that information, because it's going to essentially give less blocks that your brain has to store at any given time. Understanding probably seems obvious, but I find that it's the step that students often skip, right? They go right to memorizing their notes. They go right to memorizing the PowerPoint slides that the professor presented without actually taking that moment to think, okay, what's actually the bigger picture meaning of this? How does this all fit together? And that type of meaning and understanding, I like to think of as like the scaffolding for what you're building. And if you don't have it, you're not going to get your structure built in the right way, in a way that's going to actually be able to be stored. So that understanding step is really essential. And then the relating is really a way to sometimes provide additional scaffolding. Maybe you realize that what you're trying to learn now relates to something that you already know. And so you can kind of get that scaffolding built in from your prior knowledge. Sometimes it's a way to motivate us to actually remember that information by realizing why what's happening right now is actually important for us to remember. Perhaps we realize that we want to remember later on to ask our friend about the vacation that they're talking about taking in a few weeks, right? And just having that motivation to say, okay, this is why I want to remember this, so that in the future I can use the information in that way. These are really critical steps that all help those structures to get built, and in a way that's going to help them get stored for the long term.
So we're going to talk about some suggestions in the book now. But before I do that, there's kind of 2 things going on here. One is that we're kind of lazy and also overachieving at the same time. I think a lot of students want, the bullet points, the fast track, the synopsis, but they don't want to read the chapter kind of thing. Now, I might be being unfair here, but I get the impression that we've gotten a bit lazy. When I think of the things we were talking the other day, I had to learn by rote at school. I'm sure you did. they were just second nature. They'd roll off your, without a thought, because you'd done it so often, and it was a discipline to do it. But once you had it, it seemed to be great structure in the brain for doing more of that kind of remembering. So I wonder if we've kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater a little bit in terms of our approach to learning and acquiring knowledge. I don't know if there's any research to back that up, but I'm just going on a hunch here. Would you say that people want the easy approach? They want the results without the work?
Yeah, no, I totally agree that, one of the most important things that we emphasize is that it's important to put in effort to whatever you're trying to remember. And it actually turns out that if it seems like the learning is coming really easy, that's actually a problem, because it might actually seem easy because, for example, you're rereading the same chapter, and that can actually give you an illusion that you have stored it in your memory, but you haven't really stored it in your memory, at least not in a way that you're deeply understanding it and are going to be able to use that information when you need it. And so it is one of the things that we explain is that, if the learning feels really easy, that's not a good sign. If it's hard, if it's effortful, yeah, that's good. That's not a bad thing. That is actually a good thing.
Okay, we have a lot of very specific questions coming in. And I'm going to take a couple of them, and then we're going to go back to the suggestions of how we can help ourselves with these techniques that you've got in the book. So somebody's written about face blindness. When somebody has a stroke and there's face blindness, what therapies or exercises are available? Is that something you can answer quickly?
Maybe I'll take the first crack at that, and Elizabeth can jump in if she likes. So there is a certain area in the brain. It has a catchy little title. It's called the fusiform face area, that has evolved to help human beings, and actually other animals as well, be able to recognize faces. And when that area is damaged, just like this person who's writing in, it can make it difficult to recognize faces. But that shouldn't impair being able to recognize the person in other ways. So you can do things, for example, by listening to the sound of their voice. You can look at the cadence of how they walk. If you pay attention, everybody walks in their own unique and distinctive way. And even if that face area isn't working well, you can still pick out individual features. Like if it's someone who has bushy eyebrows, you can look for the bushy eyebrows. Or, if they have a large nose, you can look to see, if you can see that nose, or they have distinctive ears, or whatever it is, you can actually look for the individual features. And one can train oneself to get into the habit of looking for those individual features and those non-visual cues to help you identify it when someone is walking up to you.
Interesting. Do you want to add to that, Elizabeth, or?
I think that was a great answer. The only thing that I would add is that I think it is interestingly different for memory for faces, in that face blindness is really about a difficulty in the moment being able to actually have the brain perceive the face. And so even if you were simultaneously looking at two faces side by side, you would have a very difficult time knowing if they were the same face or a different face. And so it is a bit different than what, for instance, we talk about in the book, which is you see someone coming toward you and you can't recognize who that person is, why they're familiar to you. That's a different phenomenon. And that really is a loss of the memory for the face rather than a problem processing the perception of the face.
Okay, another very specific question. My dad has moderately advanced Alzheimer's. He has nearly no memory of current fact or task-related suggestions. I've noticed that he does occasionally have improved short-term memory with emotionally linked suggestions or tasks. For example, if I ask him to hurry when we need to leave the house and then repeat it 15 minutes later, he gets annoyed and remembers he's already been reminded. Has this difference been observed scientifically? And is there a way we can capitalize on this difference to help him remember other current events for longer?
So actually, one of the first scientific studies that I did in graduate school was looking at the role of emotion in the memories of individuals with Alzheimer's disease, because I was very intrigued by these sorts of anecdotes that families of individuals with Alzheimer's disease were reporting, was that it, there seemed to be some ways in which emotion might be benefiting their memories, and then other ways in which perhaps it wasn't. And so it turns out that the region of the brain that processes emotion, called the amygdala, sits very close to the region that is so important for storing those blueprints for memory, called the hippocampus. They're neighbors in the brain. And so this gives emotional content really privileged access to writing those blueprints. So for all of us, when something evokes emotion, whether it's a really positive or really negative emotion, those blueprints are going to be more likely to be written. And so we're going to be able to be more likely to rebuild that event. And it turns out that to some extent, this continues to be true for individuals with Alzheimer's disease, especially those, relatively earlier in the disease. However, Alzheimer's disease not only affects the hippocampus, it does also affect the amygdala. And so you quickly start to see, some loss of that impact of emotion on memory. But nevertheless, in many patients, there is still some advantage. So it's not getting memory to the same enhancement that you might see in individuals whose amygdala and hippocampus are preserved, but individuals with Alzheimer's disease may still be a little bit more likely to remember these emotional experiences relative to, more mundane experiences. Andrew, I don't know if there's more that you'd like to add on.
No, I think that the only thing I would add is that, I'm not saying this is a good strategy, but, when your loved one with Alzheimer's gets annoyed that you're reminding them, the fact they're getting annoyed is going to help them remember it better.
That's interesting. Okay. This raises an interesting point about when we're young, and then we'll go back to strategies. We seem to remember things effortlessly, and they seem to be like sponges, our brains. Even if we don't want to, we remember, license plates numbers and all sorts of lyrics to songs. So why is it that things like music and smell seem somehow to not just trigger memory, but seem to embed them in our consciousness? Does anybody know anything about that?
Yeah, I'll start, and Elizabeth can jump in. It's very interesting. There is actually some evidence that our memory system actually evolved almost as like the same structure, the same overall structure as our sense of smell. The two are integrally linked together. And, it's perhaps because of that smell is, felt to be, it's essentially being able to detect molecules. It's like one of the oldest senses, and it can trigger smells and tastes. And of course, most of taste is actually smell, can trigger memories. And, when we talk about this, it always reminds me of Marcel Proust, who in his book, In Search of Lost Time, which is often translated in English to the title Remembrance of Things Past, had this wonderful experience where he had this little Madeleine cookie, a little cookie shaped like a scallop that was dipped in some tea. And when he had that bite, it reminded him of his aunt giving him the Madeleine dipped in tea. And it rushed in, 4,000 pages for Proust of his memories of his time at Cambrai. And I think, many of us do have that experience. And I think it does feel stronger in some way than a visual memory. Now, memory for music is very interesting. I don't know that we understand exactly why memory is so powerful for music and why music is such a wonderful trigger. But I do know that not only do I feel this way when I hear a song. I heard a song today. It was a jazz song, but it was a song by the Doors that it was sort of jazzified. I'm like, I know that song, and I started thinking of where I was in high school when I was like listening to that song. And my patients with Alzheimer's can have a similar reaction and sort of light up with memories that they would have had difficulty retrieving. And there's this wonderful movie called Alive Inside that builds on this memory for music and how it can sort of wake up memories that have otherwise been hidden.
Well, we're getting a lot of questions in here. Some of them I'll go back to, but because we're going to be talking about medications and how they affect dementia. Can someone explain the peanut butter test as it relates to Alzheimer's? Does anyone know about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that happens in Alzheimer's is not always, but people often lose their sense of smell. And again, it's likely because where we smell and the hippocampus, the part of the memory system that stores those blueprints that Elizabeth mentioned, but it's also the part of the brain that is one of the first structures hit by Alzheimer's gets affected. So not only does the hippocampus and memory get affected, but the olfactory cortex where smelling occurs is affected. And so the peanut butter test is that if your loved one is having trouble being able to identify the odor peanut butter, it's at least possible, that it could be due to Alzheimer's. But it can be due to a lot of other things. Some people are just not good at smelling. If you had like a car accident or another traumatic brain injury, it can affect your sense of smell. In Parkinson's disease, it affects the sense of smell. So all you out there at home, don't go diagnosing people with Alzheimer's because they can't smell peanut butter, but that's what the test is.
COVID too. COVID affections.
COVID, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that.
So if we want to remember the important stuff, you have some suggestions and you say things are helpful like offloading onto calendars and reminders and also creating routines. Would you mind explaining what you meant by that in the book?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that this is a domain where we want to be thoughtful in what we're offloading, what information we're putting into our calendars, onto our to-do lists. Again, where we're relying on the fact that we're always doing something in the same way. We have the dish that we always put the keys in when we walk in the front door. Those are essentially elements that we are telling ourselves we don't need to remember because we're putting them into some other system that is not in our brains. And then we want to be thoughtful about what is the information that we actually want to be storing in our own brains. And, so I like to really think about this as the distinction of what's the information that is going to be helpful to us to actually have access to in the future, in which case we want it in our own minds. And what's the information where we just need to, we need to show up to that event on the day it's happening, but we don't later on need to know when that event was or need to remember much about the details of that event, right? And so by being strategic in what we're offloading and in what we're keeping in our minds, we can help to sort of create a reasonable amount of information that we're trying to retain, because we all know we can't devote effort every minute of every day trying to get everything into mind. We have to be selective. But then in those moments when we decide that, okay, this is really something that it's important for me to remember, and then we want to be relying on that mnemonic of 4. We want to be relying on making information distinctive, emotionally evocative if it's relevant, creating visual images, using all of these different types of strategies to really help us be able to store in mind what we want, while again being strategic about also offloading some of it so that we're not overwhelming ourselves with the memory demands throughout the day.
Great. Well, that's a handy thing to do, just to see that you're segregating and prioritizing certain things. hanging on to the things you need to. Okay, so here's the big one. Remembering names. We all struggle with this. And you really address this well in the book. In fact, we've got a part of the book, a page in the book that you devote and give us some help with this. So maybe one of you could just talk us through this.
Maybe I'll do the to learn names, and I'll let Elizabeth do the to retrieve names.
Okay.
So as we talked about, as Elizabeth talked about with the metaphor for, the first thing that you have to do when somebody is telling you their name is you have to pay attention to it. And so many times when we're meeting somebody new, we're just paying attention to other things. We're looking at their facial expression. If we're at a cocktail party, we're thinking we really want to head, and get a cocktail, or we looking at those hors d'oeuvres over there, and, we're just not paying attention. So you got to pay attention when they say the name. Sounds easy, but you have to do it. Then it's often helpful to sort of spell the name, and you can sort of spell the name out loud. There's nothing wrong with that. You can say, oh, John, is that like John, or is that Jon, like for Jonathan? It's often good to repeat the name. You can say like, oh, nice to meet you, Mary. And, maybe you can make a little, remark about it. Like, it turns out I have a sister named Mary, or something like that. It's good to make an association between the name and something that, like when I'm meeting you, Mary, your last name is Stack, but I might think like, well, it's almost like she's British, and it's like Mary, Queen of Scots, and I'll think of I'll associate that your name, Mary, with a historical figure or with someone I know, or something like that. And then it's good to create an image that will help you remember it. So I might, for example, envision you with a crown on your head. That will help me remember, with a big M. And I can almost then put that M sort of on your face with your hair and your glasses and your nose. I can sort of draw a little M. And that's important to try to link that image with you, so that I'm going to be able to remember your name when I see you next. And then I can add other connections that I know about you. Like, I know that you are a writer, and you're a book lover, and you have this wonderful background behind you with all the books. And, so I might actually think of like your hair as like pages of books. That's going to help me remember. And then the most important thing is when we're wrapping up our conversation, I would say, oh, it was so nice to chat with you, Mary. And then as I'm driving home that evening, I'll say to myself, okay, I met Mary and Elizabeth and John and the other people that I met. And if you really want to remember the name, say it again the next morning, a week later, a month later, and then those names will really stick with you a long time.
And then I think the second part of this is what happens when you see someone coming toward you and you're trying to bring that name back to mind. Now, if you've done everything that Andrew just described, hopefully most of the time the name is going to come back to you, but you're still going to find that even if you do everything very well at that encoding phase, because memory is this active process again at retrieval, you're still going to have some moments when actually you still aren't immediately able to come up with the name. And I think here, the most important thing is that we don't get in our own way. And the two most common ways that we get in our own way are that we get very anxious when we can't think of the person's name. And then we think it will help if we start thinking of what their name may be. Those are two things definitely not to do. So the first thing is to try to relax in whatever way you can. Take a deep breath, remind yourself it will be okay. It usually is not actually that noticeable if you don't immediately address someone by their name. You can be very gracious and, have an enjoyable conversation with someone without using their name a lot. So just, kind of try to relax, put this in perspective. And then don't try to generate what their name might be, because the way that memories are actually structured is that similar memories will inhibit one another. And you can imagine why this is often useful. If you're trying to remember where you parked your car today, it's actually really great that your memory for where you parked your car all the other days is inhibited, because it makes it easier for you to find the memory of where you parked your car today. But that means that if you're thinking of possible names, you're actually bringing those memories to the surface, and you're making it less and less likely that you're actually going to find the actual name that you're looking for. So don't do that. Instead, you can and should think of other sorts of dimensions that you know about the person. Where did you last see them? Maybe you remember other things about the person. You remember the person as a writer, even if you don't remember their name. You remember that, the context in which you met them. Think about that. Really kind of think back to when you were last with them, right? Those sorts of general retrieval cues and getting back into that prior context will really help. If you still need to use some type of naming-based cue, just going through the alphabet, does it start with an A? Does it start with a B? Like that can be more helpful, but don't start trying to generate alternatives. And then, we really try to emphasize these practicalities. If you're going to an event where you're likely to see certain people, just review the names ahead of time so that you actually know who it might be that you may meet. Oftentimes, we think other people are very good at recalling names, but it's actually just that people have done a lot of the work ahead of time so that they don't have those same retrieval failures. And as we say at the end, if you still can't recall someone's name, it's okay to just ask, right? We've all been there. And I think this does really help to just normalize that. Again, forgetting is normal. It happens to all of us some of the time. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that this is a moment where you're having a retrieval failure. And certainly that's going to be relatable to basically everyone that you talk with.
Thank you for that. That's great. I have to remember that list now. I guess when you get to do it and you do it more often, you do it automatically. We've got really good questions coming in. Somebody says, is it true that whenever we retrieve a memory, we then redeposit it slightly altered, so that the more retrieved, the more they drift away from its original created form, bringing up the interesting fact that the truest memories we have are those never retrieved? Wow.
Yeah, no, I do think that's true. And as Elizabeth described, retrieving a memory really means recreating it. And it is very common that we may be grabbing building blocks that may not be perfectly correct. It may have to do with a different context and where we're in. If we're, thinking about, a event from our high school, but, now we're, all grown up and in our home or something like that, we might pull in something related to our home rather than something that was actually in that high school. And then that incorrect element does get incorporated. We talk about a memory cycle, as I think Elizabeth mentioned, because we keep re-encoding that memory each time. So it's really true that these incorrect elements can be incorporated into our memories. Anything you wanted to add, Elizabeth?
No, I think that was perfect. Yeah, covered it.
Okay, very quick one here. Are individuals with ADD, if not outright diagnosis, tendencies, more at risk for dementia or being forgetful in old age?
I'll answer that quickly, that there's no evidence that I'm aware of that they're more at risk for Alzheimer's or any other type of dementia. But if you have ADD as a child, you're likely to have it as a younger adult and as an older adult. And sure, it can interfere with your ability to remember things.
Okay, so we've worked out the things that are good that can help us. Sleep, a good diet, having a good body mass index, socializing. So the things that don't help memory are when we get stressed out, too stressed, even though a little bit of stress is kind of good, there becomes a point at which chronic stress actually is very bad for your brain. And then also cramming isn't good. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, I don't know who wants to take this, about the role stress plays in aiding or sabotaging memory retrieval, particularly if you think about students getting all worked up trying to remember stuff and cramming for an exam.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as you correctly pointed out, the effects of stress on memory really depend on how much stress we're talking about. So a small amount of stress can sometimes be useful because it can bring us into focus, right? Help us focus our attention, help us be engaged enough with the information. And that kind of smaller amount of stress can be especially helpful to helping get information into memory, right? So if we know this is an important moment, we really want to be paying attention to what's going on, that small amount of stress will be helpful. But as we start to ramp up the amounts of stress, it really starts to be harmful to memory. And it's especially harmful to our ability to retrieve information from memory. And the thought here is, usually stress in our evolutionary history meant that there was an immediate threat in the environment that we needed to focus our resources on dealing with, right? There was something that was threatening our survival in most cases. And so that would probably be a pretty bad moment to be doing mental time travel back to some other moment and, mentally reminiscing about something that was going on, right? You want all of your resources focused on the current moment. And so stress really shifts the brain into that building memory structure phase, right? What's going on now? And let me maybe get some of this into memory so I avoid ever getting myself into this situation again. And it shifts it away from pulling up past blueprints and reassembling other past memories. And so this is one of the reasons why that stress can be so disruptive for students in terms of their exam performance, because a student who's feeling very anxious on the exam, they're undergoing exactly that shift. They're shifting away from retrieval, which of course is exactly what you need in order to be able to answer exam questions. And instead, what's happening is their brain is actually creating a pretty good memory for the fact that they just had this awful experience of sitting down to take an exam and not being able to recall anything. And so this can very quickly get into this cycle of exam anxiety that so many students do experience. And it really is about that role that all of us experience with stress in the moment. And you're absolutely right that cramming contributes to that in a number of ways. Cramming means that we haven't learned the information as well. There is no way to learn information as well in a crammed all at once episode as there would be if you spent that same amount of time, but spaced out your studying over a number of days, or ideally even a few weeks over the semester. Usually when we're cramming, we're also not sleeping well. In the worst case, we might have just pulled an all-nighter or nearly an all-nighter. But even if we didn't do that, we probably slept 4 or 5 hours before the exam, not the 8 hours that many students still need and adults still need. And so we know that when we're sleep deprived or even just restricted of a full night of sleep, our ability to regulate emotion is much poorer. Our ability to regulate those stress responses is much poorer. And so for all of these different reasons, cramming really can contribute to that increased effect of anxiety. Your memories aren't as strong to begin with, so you're more likely to have those retrieval failures. You're less likely to be able to regulate the stress when you start to have that buildup of a stress response. And then all of that really combines to you having this terrible experience on the exam.
Wow. And also a couple of things you've learned is that the old highlighters aren't so great, but writing notes are better, right, Andrew?
Yes, absolutely. So when you highlight your textbook and you read it, it gets easier and easier to review it. It creates this illusion that you know the material when you really don't. But when you take notes, summarize in your own words the key points, and then you test yourself on your note cards, that has been shown to be an effective way to memorize information and is much better than doing the highlighting, rereading bit. And I confess, I was one of the highlighters and rereaders, and I wish I had known what I know now about memory when I was studying in college and medical school.
Well, we're spreading the word, so
we are.
You good people can pass that bit of information on. I think it's very helpful. Also, other little things I thought were interesting, like doing the crossword is better for us than doing Sudoku for memory, and doing it in a social setting must be even more ideal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it has been studied, and it turns out that crossword puzzles are actually one good task that we think helps our thinking and memory, because a well-done crossword puzzle stretches us. It pulls us out of our comfort zone. It forces us to make new associations that we might not have thought about or discovered before. And we do think that helps to keep the whole brain active. And just like you said, in a social setting, so at least in our household, it's very common that, whoever is doing the crossword puzzle will be like, hey, do you know an 8-letter word for this, or something like that? And, my family knows my little, geeky areas of expertise, and they'll ask me about, any anatomy or any sci-fi or something like that. So I do think the social setting is key as well.
And you learn stuff all the time because of that. People
Absolutely. It does. It helps you learn new associations.
Okay, we've got so much stuff to cover. I just have to bring this up because it's something that I find really interesting, because you must deal with trauma victims as part of your work at the VA. And when you said that the brain can create kind of false memories where it thinks it's got something as you get older and it's not quite exactly as they remembered it, you wonder how many of that, the repeats of that, could create a completely false memory in trauma. Is that an area of concern?
Well, I'll tell one little anecdote, but I know Elizabeth, although she doesn't treat people with this sort of trauma, has done some research in this area and is very familiar with the research in this area. So the anecdote that I'd like to share, which I found very interesting, is that one of the things that happens in Alzheimer's disease is that because the hippocampus and related structures that are, being able to encode and store new memories, it stores those blueprints of the new memories, because that's becoming damaged, the memories that come to mind as people progress in Alzheimer's are the older memories, the memories that they had when they were teenagers. And for our veterans, they're often memories for when they were in the war. And what's interesting is that individuals who did not show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder when their memories were normal, now that they are remembering much more things that happened, in their 20s, now all of a sudden the trauma is coming out and they can actually develop full-blown PTSD symptoms because they're having these intrusive traumatic memories that are now at the top of their memories.
I think this is, still an area of really active research to try to understand all of the different ways in which traumatic experiences can affect memory networks in general, and then can affect the way that the particular traumatic experiences were remembered. And some of this actually relates back to your question about stress, where one thing that I didn't say was that when I was talking about those effects of stress, I meant acute stress, right? You're stressed out in this moment and then the exam ends and you're able to calm yourself down again. But we know that when there is chronic and sustained stress, that the stress hormones, cortisol in particular, that are released are very damaging to the hippocampus in particular, because that's a region of the brain that has a lot of receptors for cortisol. And so cortisol has a pretty dramatic effect, a negative effect on hippocampal function if there is that type of chronic exposure to stress. And so especially for individuals who have either sustained a trauma that, extended over time, or that have suffered from PTSD or other anxiety-related disorders as a result of that trauma, they're often having that chronic exposure to cortisol that's affecting hippocampal function and therefore having widespread potential effects on their memory function. But even in individuals where there might not be those chronic effects, a traumatic experience is definitely putting those stress responses at the extreme end. And we know that for many people, that really does cause an entire breakdown in this memory cycle, really in every element of it. So it's a little hard to predict from person to person what it's going to do, but we certainly know that it can mean that the memory structure isn't built at all, or it's built in a very fragmented way. The blueprints maybe get kind of written in a hard to read and fragmented way. And certainly what we often know, in PTSD, it's really characterized by these intrusive memories. And so for most of us, we rebuild these memories kind of consciously and with some effort, as we've talked about. But in PTSD, these memory structures just get built. Just all of a sudden, this moment has come back to mind, and often in an inopportune moment, right? It's not that the person wants to be thinking about this. It's just that suddenly that memory structure has gotten rebuilt. And so it's a very different type of memory cycle that is happening in individuals who have experienced trauma and have the memory for that traumatic event.
Okay, people have been asking, a lot of people, about what things in terms of supplements aid memory, things that you can take that help your brain. And then, of course, we want to talk about the prescription drugs that might compromise your memory. So let's talk about, you talked about the snake oil remedies, Andrew, but we all know fish is good for your brain. We grew up believing that, and it proves to be true. And then Prevagen, which I know you wanted to tell us is not really great use of our money. So.
Right. It's, the first thing I want to say is there's no doubt that Prevagen's ads are wonderful. I've seen some of them. They do a great job, selling their product, but there's just no convincing evidence that it really works. The Federal Trade Commission teamed up with the city of New York, and they have fined them against false advertising, and they pay a couple $1 million for the fines, and then they go back and, they're a little bit more careful. Their slogan is, we're the leading memory supplement, and I'm sure they are, but there's just no convincing evidence out there that it works. So, I ask my patients, they say, oh, you're taking Prevagen, is it helping? I never have anybody tell me they think it actually works. So, I really tell people to just save their money. So are there any supplements out there that are good for you? There really haven't been anything that has been shown to be beneficial. There are a couple vitamins that you might want to check with your doctor and just make sure your levels in your blood are normal. And those would be B12 and vitamin D. And I don't recommend you go out and take those. I just want you to check with your doctor and make sure that you have good levels in your body. The things I do recommend are having a as much as possible, whole food diet. So not so much processed foods. And some of the specific foods that we've seen to be beneficial would be, chicken, fish, fruits and vegetables, nuts and beans, and whole grains. Those would be the things that are good for you, and try to stay away from the processed food, the processed flour, the processed sugar. Those are things that are definitely shown to be not good for your brain. So supplements, I'm sorry, not a lot of evidence for supplements. Better to just eat healthy foods.
Okay, well, I'm still going to take my lion's mane, my mushrooms. So far, so good. Nothing bad's happened.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, 20 years ago, when I started practicing and caring for people with dementia, we did not know how important a healthy, balanced diet was. And it may be that, you have me back on this program a couple of years from now, I'll be saying there's amazing studies showing how good lion's mane is for you. I have an open mind about these things, just because the study hasn't been done, it doesn't mean it's not good for you. There's a lot more research that needs to be done.
Okay, so we're running out of time. I'm going to run a little bit over just because it's such a good topic and people are still very interested with their questions. So you mentioned a promising new drug that is capable of removing amyloids from the brain, which is one of the things that causes Alzheimer's, I think. So how near are we to having this and how promising is it?
Yes, so I will say briefly that the first thing is the standard FDA-approved medications that help to raise up a chemical in the brain called acetylcholine are good. They work. And anybody who's having memory loss out there, I encourage you to go to your doctor so you can get on one of these medications. But the new medicine that's out there that I'm excited about, as are my colleagues in this field of Alzheimer's disease, is a medication called lecanemab. And it is a medication that is engineered to remove this amyloid molecule, as you said, that forms amyloid plaques. And our understanding is that once the amyloid plaques form, it then damages brain cells, which build up tangles inside them, and it kills the cells, and that's what impairs thinking and memory. So it appears from the published studies that this is a major breakthrough. It does seem to slow down the disease progression. And so that means that the slopes of the placebo and the treated group diverge. And as you can imagine, the earlier that gets started, the more likely it is that this medication, can really help to, in the ideal case, to actually prevent significant memory loss from occurring. So I'm very hopeful about this medication, but we will have to see when it comes out in practice, which should be later on in 2023.
Very good. So somebody's asked a question which actually does lead into this thing about medications, and there are a lot of them because you list them in the book, that actually impair memory function. I think most people will be quite surprised. I certainly was by that list. Somebody's asked us, what role do widely used over-the-counter medications for common and chronic conditions like seasonal allergies play in cognitive decline? I'm thinking about Claritin, etc. And are they associated with dementia?
Well, I think I'll let Elizabeth start, and I'll jump in whenever she would like.
Okay. Well, the kind of broad point that I would want to make is that, we've been talking in these analogies of building and blueprints, but, all of this is really happening by cell-to-cell connections throughout the brain that are happening through lots of different chemicals. And so where we start to see effects of medication is when these different drugs are also affecting the chemicals that are being passed through the brain. And so as Andrew just mentioned, acetylcholine is one of these key chemicals that is, affected in Alzheimer's disease, but there can also be many medications that are going to affect acetylcholine as well. Dopamine is another very important chemical in the brain that especially helps to prioritize memories based on their reward or motivational salience. And there can also be medications that individuals can be taking that can affect that. So I just would sort of just start this conversation by making that general point that we always want to be keeping in mind that even if what we're trying to do is to alter the chemical balance in other organs that aren't the brain, many of the drugs are also crossing into the brain and are affecting the chemical balance that's there as well. And so that's why there are these long lists of medications.
So the only thing I'll add is that the good news is that most of the medications that are bad for your memory, and we actually have a very long list of them in an appendix in the book, most of these medications are older medications. And so in terms of the antihistamines, the specific question that was asked, Claritin is a relatively new antihistamine that is quite good in that it either doesn't affect memory at all or it's just a tiny bit. So it's really a good one. It's the older antihistamines things like diphenhydramine, which is the generic name for Benadryl. Those are older antihistamines that, let me be clear, if you're having an allergic reaction, that's the time to take it, no problem. But if you want to remember things at your best, it's better to avoid it or take one of the newer antihistamines to avoid that. And it's the same thing with a lot of the other medications in this class. Some of the older antidepressants, some of the older anti-seizure medications, some medications that are used to put you to sleep if you're feeling dizzy. Most of these, there's better, newer medicines available that are less likely to cause memory problems. So, if you look through this list and you notice that you are, or a loved one is on one of these medications, please don't stop it. I want you to just simply check with your doctor and see, is there a newer medicine that could be used that won't have these memory impairing side effects, or can the dose be lowered a little bit? But please do it in conjunction with your prescribing doctor.
Good advice there. So a last question, and there are many, many more that we just couldn't get to. We now know how important this idea of the gut and a healthy gut and a healthy brain seem to be integrally linked somehow. Depression and all sorts of other things seem to be connected with your gut. Is there any connection between memory and good gut health that you know of?
So I'll start, and Elizabeth can jump in there. There certainly, I'll just mention for Alzheimer's, there is a lot of active research on this topic. There is some evidence that the microbiome of the gut is helpful in giving us sort of the right immunity and not the wrong immunity in terms of other sort of bacteria and viruses and things like that. So Alzheimer's has been associated, for example, with poor dental hygiene and things like that related to, sort of bacteria around the teeth and things like that. There's also been viral infections, and people are even theorizing scarily that COVID could possibly predispose one to Alzheimer's. So there is some evidence for that.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that just two small points. I think this is a really active area of research, and so probably one of those domains where in a few years we might have much more specific answers. But we know that when there are problems within the intestines or in the gut, that there are stress signals essentially that are being sent to the brain, and so it can actually be one source of some of the release of those stress hormones that we talked about, and one of the causes of that stress cascade. And it may be for that reason that the hippocampus is one of the regions that has been shown to be particularly sensitive to that gut microbiome. And so I do think that, again, there's a real reason why there is such interest in that connection between not just the gut and the brain generally, but to memory specifically.
Great. Well, we could go on and on with this. It's such a ripe and huge topic, but it impacts so many aspects of our life, of course, and more and more as we get on. So all I say is the book is fabulous. It's full of very helpful and intriguing information that I certainly didn't know about the memory. So I'd like to thank you both, Andrew and Elizabeth, for writing the book and for this great conversation today, which we all learned a lot. And I'm sorry if we got your name spelled wrong, Andrew, on your...
No, it's all fixed. Thank you.
Budson. Cambridge Forum is made possible through generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, and Cambridge Community Foundation. And of course, you. I was thinking if everyone had given us $5 today for this, we would be in very good shape. So if you haven't given anything for a while, now's the time. Go to the website, www.cambridgeforum.org, and you can donate. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on March 15th. And thank you again, Elizabeth and Andrew.